Now, Andrew, I want to ask you about some of the most popular coverage that you did when you were in Ottawa reporting on the convoy. And that was just straight up plain live streams of the protests. Why do you think that coverage in particular was so impactful for people?
Yeah, it was interesting. I had been working too hard at first, I think, by trying to, do really in-depth journalism when a lot of people just wanted to see it. And I think there were two reasons for that, Christine. The first was that there were a lot of people that couldn't be there that really wanted to be a part of it. They just wanted to feel like they were on the ground, get a sense of this thing that was giving a lot of Canadians that have been in a very dark place because of pandemic restrictions, a little bit of hope and community. And community was key. The second part, and I think this is the more interesting aspect of it, there was such distrust for mainstream media coverage that people just didn't trust that what they were seeing on the news was an accurate reflection of it, that this might just be a 30-second clip out of something that makes this person look bad, but what happened around it. So I think people just wanted to see for themselves the unfiltered, unbridled, unannotated version of what was happening on the ground. And I mean, anyone who's ever tried to use their cell phone in minus 20-degree weather knows the battery drains quickly. So had to keep recharging, going back to the hotel, going back out. But just walking around with a Periscope, or not Periscope anymore, but a Twitter live stream was really what people wanted.
Let's talk about the money that was involved in the convoy. There was a huge amount of money that was first donated through GoFundMe. What happened to that money? Was it withdrawn to use to fund the convoy? What was it used for? Who withdrew it? Who was in charge of accessing that money? What can you tell me about that?
So almost all of the donations that people were paying attention to, the ones that were public in nature, didn't make it to the protesters. And the GoFundMe raised about $10 million. The first $1 million of that was released into a TD bank account, as well as some direct e-transfers that were sent there. But TD actually unilaterally froze that money very early on, and their excuse was something about fraud prevention. And the organizers had only pulled out, I think it was about $36,000 of that, which went to fuel. And the rest of it, as we know, when GoFundMe canceled the account, was refunded eventually to donors. So organizers pivoted to Give, Send, Go, which is an American online crowdfunding site. And they raised in a fraction of the time, the same amount. I think it was about 10.5 million Canadians, so roughly the same. And then the Ontario government got a secret court order behind closed doors to basically prohibit any handling of that money. You couldn't have it, you couldn't spend it, you couldn't use it. And once that happened, it became virtually impossible to get money from the US into Canada without it being frozen. So ultimately, Give, Send, Go ended up refunding donors as well. And there were some workarounds to that. Cash was huge. People would just bring cash, large amounts of cash all day, every day. They'd send it up. Some people would donate $10. Some people would bring thousands. And then there was also a small...
Sorry, who was in charge of handling this cash and deciding how it would be, distributed to people involved in the protests?
Well, and that's where you get into this not-for-profit that was set up that Tamara Leach ran and that some of the road captains were involved in. And they had their own system, and they had, by their account, quite detailed accounting records of it. But they had cash counting machines. They were putting stuff in envelopes. They were delivering envelopes to trucks. But they also had, and the book describes this in fair detail, a really, really complex and sophisticated way of getting fuel, where they were buying it directly from a bulk fuel distributor who was dropping it off at 2 scheduled deliveries a day. Then they would transfer it from a tanker to these slip trucks, which would go up and down the streets and refuel the trucks that needed diesel. And they were doing this by paying directly. So a lot of the money went to fuel. But also a lot of the other things people would bring directly. People would bring food. People would bring clothing. People would pay for hotel rooms. So the money was not as much the lifeblood of this protest as the government and media thought it was.
Especially since a lot of the money never ultimately made its way into the hands of the protesters. Because
most of it didn't.
And the Give, Send, Go money, that was also refunded, right? It was never distributed.
Yeah, and there's been some media coverage that has raised some doubt about that. Give, Send, Go claims it refunded basically all of it because they were worried that the Canadian government was going to work with the US government to seize that money. So they tried to get it back into the donors' hands when they realized that there was no way they were going to get that into Canada to the actual places that it was donated to.